Good morning, or afternoon, depending where you are. Welcome to the Rocky River Public Library presentation on recapturing the Philippines in World War II. This is a celebration of the 75th anniversary of the United States granting the Philippines their total independence post-World War II. My name is Dr. William Bailey. I'm Associate Professor Emeritus from the University of Arkansas, Fayetteville. I moved here with my family about 3 years ago to Rocky River, and it's my privilege to present this material. The goal of presentation of a two-part series. This first presentation will cover the demographics and the Philippines themselves. It will look briefly at the Battle of the Bay of Manilla and the Treaty of Paris and its results. We will look somewhat more at the American-Philippine War that took place from 1900 through 1913, and then we will discuss at length the capture of the Philippines by the Japanese and the Battle of Bataan and the Bataan Death March in 1942. Here are the Philippines, surrounded by ocean, numerous islands. It's more than 1,000 miles north and south, and more than 700 miles wide at its widest point. I have chosen this eruption of Mount Pinatubo from 1991, which is only 54 miles northwest of Manila itself, because it is a metaphor for life and policy issues within the Philippine Islands from the time they were colonized by the Spanish until the present day. There have been wars, capture, recapture, rebellion, capture, recapture, and death throughout the Philippines as various groups have tried to take it from other groups, etc. It's been a very violent nation internally. We wanted the Philippine Islands basically as an area for our markets, but also to open up the potential for the markets in China and Japan. And at the point in time, demographically, we're talking about around 1900, there are almost 6.5 million Filipinos living in the islands, but only about 2,000 of the islands were actually inhabited. One of the goals of our colonization was to Christianize the nation that was already Catholic, but anti-Catholicism was alive and well in America at that time. So basically, Protestant ministers and clergy came by the thousands to be missionaries in the Philippine Islands. In addition to the Catholics that are predominant within the population, there are Muslims living in the south and several thousand of this particular group that live in a particular chain that basically are animist, combining some Christian thoughts and attitudes. It's very difficult to work external to the Philippines because of all these languages. Of course, Spanish and English are basically the language of business and industry. At one time, it was thought, as the United States was taking the Philippine Islands from the Spanish, that it might be very rich in minerals and petroleum because the Dutch West Indies south of there were rich and a target. And so it was possible we were getting a very valuable resource. Again, this policy was generally forced by looking at markets and wanting us to become an imperialist colonialist power, as was Great Britain and Germany and France. And what was going on when we arrived in the Philippines was that Manila was under attack by thousands of soldiers of the First Philippine Republic. And as a result, when Admiral Dewey approached the harbor of Manila, the American Council had discussed with the Spanish garrison what should happen when Dewey began shelling. And it was agreed that there would be no shelling of the city and no Spanish or American troops were to die. But as usual in the fog of battle, everything falls apart after the first shot. The Spanish generals, in fact, had already surrendered to Americans in order to keep the rebels out of the city because they were afraid that the rebels might execute them. So this painting of the Battle of Manilla is, in fact, exaggerated. Here comes the cruiser Olympia with its 8-inch guns firing. They fired at no ships whatsoever. They sank no ships, and none of the sailors were killed or injured. Our 6 killed were individual soldiers who were on the ground, caught in a crossfire between the rebels and the Spanish troops. We also killed 49 Spanish troops because one of our ships bombarded the center of town for about 10 minutes before they got the message, you don't do that, stop shooting. Some of the troops entering Manila were commanded by General Arthur MacArthur, Jr., who is the grandfather of General Douglas MacArthur II. When we acquired the Philippines through the Treaty of Paris, there was an extreme debate in the Senate and in the society of the United States. Should we take these properties and declare sovereignty over them of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines? There was also discussion of taking Cuba, but we didn't do it. In the process, we paid $20 million to Spain for that land and those nations because they had improved the islands. They'd put in bridges and roads, etc. But here you have the President of the United States, President McKinley, debating the expansionist and on the other side the anti-expansionist, and being the Republican that he was, he looks toward the expansionist and agrees we should expand and accept these properties and become an imperial power. The moment we acquire the islands, the first Republic rebels of the Philippines begin fighting us. It's known by various names. And they had about 40,000 troops in country that had been fighting the Spanish. And those troops then turned their guns on American troops. The war was fought fairly conventionally for about 6 months, but because they had no artillery or weapons that could match ours or had the training we had, clearly they were losing it. So it turned from a conventional war into a guerrilla war. And in the process of fighting that terrible guerrilla war, it was very similar to the war we fought with the Viet Cong. There were free fire zones where anybody walking in it was killed. There were patrols that went into villages and did atrocities and torture. There were atrocities on both sides. And for example, we were constantly being ambushed on patrol at night when we were walking in the urban areas. It was the hope of the Filipinos that we would be fought to a stalemate, and as a result, we would withdraw. But that did not happen. But this horrific process came much closer and tighter as we established leadership under the Army for the whole island chain and declared martial law. We captured the head rebellion person, and his successor, General Malvar, continued to fight against the Americans. A group of American troopers were on the island of Samar, and they had taken all of the men and put them in 2 tents. And one night, some of the women had taken various knives into their tents. And the next morning, as the American troopers were eating their breakfast nearby, they attacked with these knives and killed over 50 of them. There were only about 60 to begin with. General J.M. Smith then gave the order that anyone over the age of 10 should be shot and killed. As a result, over 1,000 men and boys in Samar were killed, so it's known as the Samar Massacre. After the war, General Smith was court-martialed for his giving this order to kill these people over the age of 10, and he had to retire from the army. So this Philippine War led to the so-called Philippine Organic Act of 1902. As a result, the Filipinos made peace with us, and we created a Bill of Rights for them. As a result of the war, almost 200,000 Filipino civilians had died, most of the losses, of course, the result of famine and disease. We had killed about 20,000 Filipino combatants. At the same time, we had lost over 4,000 of our own soldiers. There were fighting and continued with the Muslim groups down in southern the Philippines until 1913. In 1934, the pressure to relieve the Philippines of the burden of being our colony, we agreed that we would give them independence. And we promised them that independence in 1944. But of course, World War II interfered with the Japanese occupation. In 1946, the Treaty of Manilla was signed, and we relinquished our control of the Philippines as our colony and made them an independent nation. The former military leader, Manuel Gonzalez, a revolutionary military leader, became the first president of the Commonwealth of the Philippines. During the period of time that we were moving the Philippines to independence, we became aware that the Japanese was targeting taking the Philippines, and the president of the Philippines came to General MacArthur, who was stationed there in Manila, and said, "We want you to create a Philippine Defense Force, a Philippine Army," in 1935. And MacArthur asked President Roosevelt, "Can I do this? And can I do this when I have the rank of Field Marshal of the Philippine Army?" So it was agreed that that could occur, and he would continue to receive his Major General salary from the U.S. Army and become a Field Marshal for the Philippines and receive income from that. At one time, the president of the Philippine Islands gave in cash to MacArthur $500,000, which in today's equivalent money was about $8 million. By the way, his chief of staff happened to be a guy named Dwight Eisenhower, who later becomes the supreme U.S. commander in Europe. While they were working together, there were strong disagreements on how to arrange the Philippine Army and put it together, and as a result, MacArthur and Eisenhower both butted heads, and the antipathy that they had with each other lasted their lifetimes. The goal was to train 20,000 Filipino soldiers, but that goal did not start until 1937. And all the equipment and materials given to them were materials from World War I. The ammunition, the rifles, the artillery, it was all in desperately shape and was obsolete, and much of the ammunition didn't fire. Of course, the budget for the nation itself was not sufficient to create this army, neither the American budget, because we were in the Great Depression, and neither the budget of the Philippine Islands. It was also agreed that in addition to the Army, there would be an Air Force, a Philippine Air Force, but it didn't get off the ground literally. They didn't begin training pilots until 1939. One of the issues that we faced was the fact that the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 prevented us from building up our capacity on the islands for defense. And the naval base at Corregidor was prevented from modernizing. Clark Field had its issues also. And MacArthur retired from the U.S. Army in 1937 and stayed in Manila with his wife and 2-year-old child by that point in time, I believe, as a military advisor to the president. Talking about Douglas MacArthur is very difficult because this is a quote from one of his most interesting biographies, the most controversial figure in American military history. An individual with various contradictions, contrast, extremes. He received the Medal of Honor, but when the battles began on the Philippine Islands, he basically stayed away from the front lines. When the move to Bataan occurred, he moved to Corregidor with his family. By the way, he was told, evacuate your family 6 months before the Japanese attacked, and he refused to do it. He seemed to be very hesitant in how he defended the Philippine Islands. He demanded loyalty from his subordinates like Eisenhower, etc., but continually talked about the head of the Army and the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army and the military and the President of the United States. In 1944, he almost became the Republican candidate for president against Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And all of this is discussed and linked in William Manchester's biography of him called American Caesar. So as we end, here is the raising of the American flag at Fort Santiago. This was a Spanish fort, and as you can see, these 1890 guns are pointed to the ocean. We shelled this fort with 5 or 6 rounds, and that was about all during the Battle of Manilla. So this ends the part 1 of the American-Filipino War and our agreement to build an army to defend the Philippine Army, a nation. Why did the Japanese seem so interested in capturing the Philippines? Well, in part, it was a result of the decision to attack Pearl Harbor and the fear that with the location of the Philippine Islands, we would cut off the expansion of the Japanese into the Dutch East Indies, that we would want to prevent them from getting the oil and petroleum and other resources they needed to run their war machine. So this expansion would create what was known as a Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. Asians for Asians, it was said. And they felt, the Japanese felt, that if anyone resisted them who was Asian, was not appreciative of what they were doing for them. In the meantime, they are talking about attacking Pearl Harbor, in 1939, we send the U.S. Pacific Fleet from San Diego to Pearl Harbor so we would be closer to the Philippines to prevent the Japanese takeover. So the harbor was filled with the battleships of our fleet in the Pacific waiting to be attacked. Meanwhile, on the island of the Philippines, we lined up all the B-17s, all 40 that we had, in a nice little row. We did the same thing with all of the fighters, P-35s, P-40s, and we lined them up. And the day that Pearl Harbor was hit, oh, by the way, you'll notice up here that this is the American symbol with the red ball on it. We changed that quickly because it was being misidentified as a Japanese aircraft. Here is what the Pacific looked like as we prepared to World War II. So the attack on Pearl Harbor, the capture of Wake, the capture of Guam here, and here the Philippines, we were afraid that we would cut off their supplies to this area. And of course, the Japanese planned to take Indochina and Thailand and Burma from the British and take this area and all the way down. And the goal was in part to take New Guinea, and then the possibility of attacking Australia. And of course, they went into the Solomon Islands, where a little place called Guadalcanal was located. MacArthur, in the meantime, in 1941, was recalled by the president from his retirement and made the commander of the U.S. Army Forces of the Far East. This force was to include U.S. soldiers, Philippine regular army, police, and reserve divisions made of basically civilians. We lined up, as I said, their P-40s and our bombers, and we sent an additional 8,500 troops, American troops, to the island and to reinforce. So by the time that the Battle of the Philippines occurred against the Japanese, there were about 31,000 defensive troops available, most of them on Luzon, the northern island, and near Manila. We also put out some World War I destroyers and USS Houston, a heavy cruiser. The plan was to stop the Japanese around Manila, get all of our forces in close, put all of our supplies in Manila, and hold Manila until reinforcements could come. That was Manila, Bataan, and Corregidor. However, MacArthur decided that wasn't the way to go, and he decided instead to fight on the beaches, and in order to do that, I think he was clearly influenced by Churchill's speeches. He spread his troops thinly across the edges of Luzon Island, and supplies were scattered from hither to yon. So as a result, when we prepared to defend the islands, half the supplies were lost immediately because they weren't accessible and you didn't have sufficient transportation. In order to defend Luzon, MacArthur needed at least 200,000 combat-ready troops, and he, of course, did not have it. As a study was performed by Lieutenant Colonel Jeffrey Fairbanks in 1991, it said, his strategy was grandiose, his objectives overambitious, and very unrealistic. Rather than putting the supplies near Manila and Bataan, again, he put them all over the island. December 8, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor occurs at 7:30 Pacific time on December the 7th, which is the same time in Manila as 3:30 a.m. on December the 8th. We crossed the international time zone. People tried to reach MacArthur, but they failed. He didn't know the fact that Pearl Harbor had been attacked until early the next morning. His chief of staff and the head of the American Air Force, or the Filipino Air Force, wanted to launch B-17s immediately and attack Formosa, which was only 200 miles away, and bomb the ships and troops who were already there, planning to invade the Philippines. It was 10:15 the next morning when the raid was approved, but the information did not get to the right people, and around 12:40, the Japanese attacked and destroyed more than 50% of the aircraft at Clark Field and some of the other field in a matter of minutes, and strafed the area. Here is the area of Luzon. Here is Manila. Here is Bataan and Corregidor. The initial goal was to protect this area here, and the Japanese knew it. But we had scattered troops all along the edge here and had a few troops down here. So the Japanese send troops from Formosa. They take this island. They come here from the north. They make another landing here and go toward the north there. The primary force came in this area here. And Day 1, they had at least 10 miles into the beach. Day 2, they kept forcing the troops back and back, and by day 5, the defense line was very close to Manila. And more troops landed from other locations in the south and began to attack Manila from the south. They started with 2,500 troops on day 1. American ships were recalled from the Philippine Islands because of the bombings on December the 10th at the harbor that we had, and then the main attack of 43,000 troops and Japanese tanks land on the eastern coast through Luzon. The retreat began very rapidly, and several passes of the mountain were chosen for defensive positions, but because the Japanese had much better artillery and more of it, we retreated. As a result, we moved all of our troops back to Bataan, and Douglas MacArthur went to Corregidor. The troops began to see that he was not on the front line, so they started talking about him and gave him a new name, Dugout Doug. Here is a poem and song written at that time that was transported to America by someone. And as you can see, the main line down here, I think, and his troops go starving on. It was a disaster from day 1. December 24th, the withdrawal goes completely to Bataan, that little peninsula, and 80,000 troops of various groups go into that area with 28,000 refugees flooding into Bataan, trying to protect themselves from the Japanese troops, and they continue to be bombed and shelled all this time by Japanese aircraft because we had no defense. Many of these Japanese troops had been fighting in China for years, and as a result, they were very good at what they did, and they knew what they were doing. Almost all of our supplies, that's food, ammunition, trucks, tanks, all had been destroyed by constant bombing and shelling by the Japanese. So here we are in the island, the peninsula of Bataan, and down here is the little island of Corregidor. On January the 8th, we established a defense line and hope that this mountain range in here will stop these troops from coming into us. In the meantime, in March, MacArthur and his wife and son, who was that time 4, were put in PT boats and taken to Mindanao, where he boarded a B-17 and went to Australia. Here's an example of a Japanese mortar which fired more than 2,000 shells on Corregidor and in this area. It was a disaster from day 1. Here's another poem. We're the battling bastards of Bataan, no mama, no papa, no Uncle Sam, no aunts, no uncle, no nephews, no nieces, no pills, no planes, no artillery pieces, and nobody gives a damn. Here is the Gibraltar of the East, Corregidor. There is a topside barracks, and there are some various tunnels that have been built in here. We have thousands of men on this island. They're being bombed every day. There was a little landing field here. So this was the island that they began to shell from across the bay and began to think about how to invade it. The life on the island was miserable. All of the troops, be they Filipino or American, were given about 30 ounces of food daily and would be given water twice a day. And remember, this is the tropical heat over 100 degrees. And if there was shelling or bombing going on, the water could not be taken to the men fighting on the front lines. The Japanese dropped more than 1,700 bombs, or 365 tons of explosives, on this small island. As a result, we lost hundreds of men and thousands lay wounded in the tunnel hospital, where the few Army and Navy nurses and doctors took care of the wounded as best as possible until the surrender. After the surrender, the Japanese at least allowed some of the nurses to stay on the island until the men got better. This gives you an idea of what the tunnel looked like. 11 Navy nurses, 66 Army nurses, 1 nurse anesthesiast. They were all captured and imprisoned, and by the time mid-1942 occurs, they're all in Manilla in a prison. They continued to serve as a nursing unit throughout the war. They did the best they could under the circumstances, having no military medical supplies. But they moved them to Manila, where they helped everyone who was a POW as best they could. After the war, they were all who survived were given the Bronze Star. It's my personal opinion they all should have been given the Medal of Honor for the challenge they faced over 3 years. But that's just my point of view. Here is the command group inside the island, command center inside the tunnel. So on May the 5th, 1942, the Japanese attacked Corregidor. And General Wainwright gets a message to FDR and says, there is a limit of human endurance, and that point has been long passed, talking about his soldiers and sailors that he had on his island as the Japanese poured on board. This particular attack was repulsed with great loss, but they came again with more and eventually captured all of the island in a very short period of time. Last U.S. position is May 6th, and we surrendered at that point in time. May 6th at 1:30 p.m., we surrendered with 2 Americans going forth with a white flag to the Japanese on the island. Here are the people coming out of the tunnel with the Japanese soldiers being prepared there to receive them. The Marine Colonel, Howard, was able to burn the Marine Corps Regiment's flag as well as the national colors to prevent their capture. Regrettably, the American colors are being taken down here from an old Spanish flagpole that was on the island on May the 6th. The Battle of Bataan had lasted 3 months. Something between 60 and 80,000 Filipino and Americans had been captured, and they were massed at 2 different locations on the peninsula of Bataan, and the Japanese troops were ordered by General Homa, who was very much aware of what he did not want to happen. He wanted the prisoners to be taken peacefully to Camp O'Donnell and not harmed. But he sat back in his villa and gave these orders, and they were ignored. The first thing that Americans and Filipino troops had to do was take and empty their pockets and everything they had. Anyone, American or Filipino, who had any Japanese money on them was immediately shot or bayoneted or beheaded, because it was assumed they got that money from dead Japanese soldiers. In addition, one colonel took between 350 and 400 Filipino soldiers, took them to a riverbank, and had them all shot. Now our men, Filipino and American, face 60-mile march with little or no food, and it's 100 degrees in the blazing sun of the jungle. In addition, they had been in poor shape already. So the death march, Bataan Death March, begins at this location and marches to the location where there is a train line to take them to Camp O'Donnell. Clearly more than 10,000 Filipino troops died during the march. They seem to have treated the Americans a little better. Only 500 to 650 American troops died during the march. Here is the march. Here is General Wainwright, here with his belongings tied about his neck, his arms tied behind his back. Look at this man's face. Everyone had already lost between 15 and 20 pounds, maybe 30 pounds during the time they were on the Bataan and Corregidor Island. As they marched along, anyone who stumbled and fell would be bayoneted or pulled aside so the trucks later could run over them. General Homa, here he is. He stated in his testimony at his trial after the war that he had no idea how many people had been captured, and he only had food for so many, and he only had a train that would carry so many. So here is the man known as the Beast of Bataan. And when the troops got to the train to take them to O'Donnell, they were packed in so badly, no one could do anything but stand for that day. And when the train arrived, thousands had died in the train itself of disease and diarrhea. It was a horrible situation. I'll not go into the conditions of Camp O'Donnell, but you can read about those. There's a lot of descriptions of that. The United States, after and during the war, made propaganda posters to get people to become soldiers and sailors. Here is one of those pieces of propaganda made by the U.S. Army. And every day, hundreds died at Camp O'Donnell of disease, malnutrition, murder, beheadings, bayoneting. It was the most horrible conditions. I read one chapter in a book about it, and I was nauseous. If you're interested in the movies made about this particular time in our history, I can honestly say, as a child, I can remember the movie Bataan, even though it was made in 1943. It was done on television in the 1950s in black and white. It's a story of 13 soldiers gathered together in a group, and Robert Taylor is sergeant because the captain is killed almost immediately, and Sergeant Dane, or Robert Taylor, is seen in the very last scene pointing his machine gun toward the camera, firing away, as you know he's about to be killed by the Japanese soldiers who are attacking. The movie Bataan was selected as one of the 400 best American films of all time, and you can see it on various streaming services today. Just Google Bataan streaming. The additional movie of that time was this movie, They Were Expendable, based on a book by the same title, directed by the great John Ford. And it's about the reality of what happened, more or less, to those individuals who were taken from Corregidor, taken to the island of Mindanao, where they got on airplanes and flew to Australia. Of the 4 PT boats that left Corregidor, one sank because it had fallen apart, basically. The other 3 made it there. And in the film, one of the PT boats attacks a Japanese cruiser. It hits it with a torpedo, but in reality, that did not happen, as various other things in the movie did not happen. Both of the commanders of the PT boats were given medals of honor for transporting MacArthur. Immediately, the Filipinos, having been occupied by the Japanese and by the Americans, began a guerrilla war against the Japanese. As a result, that war goes on and is very successful in pinning down thousands of Japanese troops and killing numerous Japanese troops. the Filipinos remain very loyal to the Americans because they know after the war they're going to gain independence. However, the Japanese kill thousands of Filipinos, starve them to death in work details as they're creating defenses, etc. In addition, hundreds, if not thousands, of young Filipino women between the ages of 12 and 16 are made into comfort women, put in locations where the Japanese soldiers rape them on a daily basis while they're on the island of the Philippines. Numerous other war crimes occur, and after the war, most of the war crimes are those who are seen to be having committed those are either shot or hung. Many Filipinos started a bartering program, if not outright giving food and medicine to the Allied prisoners, particularly in the prison camps in Manila. MacArthur now winds up in Australia. And it is in Australia where he's changing trains that he makes his famous speech. I came through and I shall return. He then is made General of the Army with 5 stars and becomes the Supreme Commander of the Southwest Pacific area, which we'll discuss more at length. Here's MacArthur with his wife and son Arthur. The next presentation will be about recapturing the Philippines and the battles that occurred prior to it at sea. Again, thank you for your time. I appreciate it. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation.